overturn the election results. Do you remember then Vice President Mike Pence on January 6th? He refused to go along with Donald Trump's plans to stay in office, and he certified the election results anyway. And let's be honest, many of us might not have agreed with Pence on a lot of things, but that day he upheld the Constitution and helped protect democracy. But when Donald Trump returned to the White House 4 years after his 2020 loss, he made sure there would be far less room for that kind of dissent. As the New York Times points out, anybody seeking to join the second Trump administration had to pass a pretty key litmus test. Did they believe that the 2020 election was stolen? And if election denier was not on your resume, then there is a pretty good chance it was crumpled up and it was tossed in the trash. And some of those who were tasked with actually protecting our elections were tossed to the side too. According to ProPublica, at least 75 people across several agencies who were involved in the federal effort to safeguard elections are now gone. Poof. Some resigned, some were fired, others were reassigned, particularly inside the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security. So what happened and who is there in their place? Roughly 24 political appointees, many of them with ties to the election denial movement. 10 of them were directly involved in efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Others are close associates of those who were. Experts warn that the election denial movement is no longer operating outside of the government. It is now interwoven within parts of it. And that is what makes this moment different. Donald Trump is no longer surrounded by officials who are willing to tell him no. He is surrounded by people who largely share his views, with allies now holding key positions all across the government. The president has them, and he's turned the full power of the federal government toward one of his longest-running grievances, that 2020 election that he categorically lost to Joe Biden, the most investigated election in history. And yet on Thursday night in prime time, there he was, repeating crazy claims that hundreds of thousands of non-citizens were on voter rolls and that countries like China and Venezuela interfered in the vote. Gone are the days of the most secure election in American history, all to undermine the election system and sow seeds of doubt about its integrity. And you know what? It took less than 24 hours for his administration to take action, to threaten election officials with prison time if they did not comply with the government's efforts to change election policies.
If the election officials, once we gave them the information they need to secure their elections, and they chose not to, then those individuals can also be held accountable by fines, by penalties, and even, depending on how far it goes, prison time.
This is nuts stuff. While Donald Trump's first administration was filled with more traditional government officials or people with extensive military backgrounds, this time around he is surrounded by people like these guys. Pete Hegseth, Todd Blanche, Markwayne Mullin, people who are not pushing back on the president's worst impulses. Just last week, Jay Clayton, Trump's pick for Director of National Intelligence, refused to answer one simple question: who won the 2020 election?
Answer the question. Who won the 2020 election?
I have answered the question.
Answer it. What is your answer?
I've given you my answer.
What is your answer? You refuse to answer a basic question about who won a presidential election, but you asked to lead America's intelligence community? Isn't it humiliating to be unable to answer this question, to have to indulge the president's delusions?
I could watch that all day long on repeat. 2026 will serve as an unprecedented stress test of the integrity of the American election system. The question is not whether the president still disputes the outcome of the 2020 election. He made that super clear on Thursday night. The real question is what happens if the results of another election do not go his way. Because this time, many of the people who challenged him from inside his own administration are gone. And the people who have replaced them were chosen in part because they were willing to go along with whatever the president says. Joining me now is Ellen Weintraub, former commissioner of the Federal Election Commission. She served for more than 2 decades, including multiple terms as chair before